afternoon. My name is Danilo Petranovic. I work here at the Abigail Adams Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event. The Abigail Adams Institute is an independent, scholarly, not-for-profit located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our mission is to foster and fortify traditional humanistic education at Harvard. Another program that Abigail Adams Institute is, as of late, been involved with is the Wollstonecraft Project. And to hear more, I will introduce AAI Senior Fellow and a good friend of mine, Erica Bakioki. Erica is an author of soon-to-be published book called The Rights of Women, Notre Dame University Press, which will be out this fall. Erica, would you like to take it away and introduce our speaker for today?
Yes. Hello. It's wonderful to be here doing this Zoom event with all of you at Abigail Adams. And yes, the Wollstonecraft Project is a new project based out of Abigail Adams Institute. And what we're trying to do is, our mission statement is that we aim to guide, facilitate, and support scholarly engagement in questions of sexual equality and freedom as philosophically informed by a realist metaphysics, a virtue-based ethics, and a Wollstonecraftian understanding of rights grounded in responsibilities. So though we've kicked off in this time of COVID, we have many great things going on, especially our signature course, Man, Woman, Body, Soul in the Western tradition, and other events coming up. But we're very excited about this event today with Carol Crossed. I'm so happy and honored to get to introduce her, my friend for several years now. On the 201st birthday of her hero and mine, Susan B. Anthony, Carol's own life, much like her heroes, is an inspiring story of courage and perseverance in which she has consistently responded to assaults on human dignity and has always worked toward peaceful and nonviolent solutions. Carol began her work in human and civil rights activism while attending Howard University in the summer of 1965. She was trained as a facilitator and has been a leader in nonviolent civil disobedience since the 1970s anti-Vietnam War movement. In the 1980s, she was a supporter of human rights for indigenous populations, particularly in South America. For 15 years, she has served as editorial assistant to New York State Feminist. She was an editor of Voices for Peace and Life, and also a contributor to the really wonderfully informative book, Pro-Life Feminism, Yesterday and Today. In 2006, Carol purchased and restored the birthplace of Susan B. Anthony in Adams, Massachusetts. 4 years later, it opened as a historic house museum, honoring the feminist foremother, an achievement for which Carol received the Northern Berkshire, Massachusetts Business and Professional Woman Award. In addition to being a founder and president of the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum, Carol's also the president of Feminists Choosing Life of New York and is the mother of 6 children and the grandmother to 17. One of the most remarkable rooms in the Birthplace Museum is dedicated to suffrage era postcards that Carol collected over many, many years. When I had the opportunity to visit several years ago, I spent the vast majority of my time that I was in the museum viewing these postcards. For that reason, when I learned from Carol a couple of years ago that she was planning a book featuring this collection in time for the centennial celebration of women's suffrage last year, I was just so excited to hear about the project and honored to get to see an early version of it. And so I'm just thrilled that she is here to share her book, Vintage Tweets, which I have here and is placed on our coffee table in my house because I just think it's so fun. Such a great way to learn about women's history. So welcome, Carol, to the Abigail Adams Institute. We're just so happy that you are with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Erica. It's just an honor to be here, and you're one of my heroines. So I follow in your footsteps, even though I'm much older. I want to, when I grow up, I want to be like you. It's so much more fun to talk about women's suffrage through pictures. And this is not just through any pictures. It's through their very own pictures that they use to promote suffrage. So it's a unique way. It's the closest thing that we can come to understanding suffrage through their own words. So as Erica mentioned, today, of course, is Susan B. Anthony's birthday. So she is 201 years of age today. She was born in 1820. And last year, when we celebrated the suffrage centennial in 2020, it was 100 years, the passage of the 19th Amendment. Susan B. Anthony was exactly 200 years of age. Because of COVID, a lot of these events and projects, presentations and conferences related to the suffrage amendment are happening this year. And of course, on many under the same COVID circumstances, but we're just getting a little bit more time and play around educating ourselves to organize, agitate, educate. Of course, that's Susan B. Anthony's favorite saying. Just the first few pictures here, we're going to talk just to show you a little bit of the museum. This is some of the pictures in the museum. The picture on the left is Susan B. Anthony, the room where Susan B. Anthony was born. Interesting, the quilt on the wall depicts her colleague and closest friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in front of her home in Seneca Falls, New York. She's raising a flag to announce the birth of her 7th child, Robert. And she was not, part of that milieu that wanted to hide their pregnancy. She was proud of the fact that she was a mother and could give birth. So she would have none of this stuff with, the stork brought the child. No way. She raised a flag to say that she gave birth to her son, Robert. So that's a very fun thing. The journaling around the quilt, by the way, was an art project of a student, a high school student. And the textiles in the quilt, some of them are as early as 1860. But the journaling around the quilt is something that Elizabeth said in a letter to Julia Ward Howe. And it says, when we consider that women are treated as property, it is degrading to women that we should treat our children as property to destroy as we see fit. And that, of course, is a statement against abortion. The picture on the right is Susan's father's store on the right. And again, I'm shamelessly advertising the museum here. The picture here is of Susan at age 6. And if you're wondering why it is that we have a painting or a photograph of Susan, you're correct in wondering why in 1826 she would be photographed. First of all, there was no photography in 1826. But more than that, her parents would probably not have approved of her image being taken or showcased. The Quakers believed in the inner light of God and only a profile. So you oftentimes see profiles, and those are basically Quaker representations of persons. So this is the museum today after it was restored. And if you want to know how we knew how to restore it, we had the postcards to show. And so we'll begin the postcard exhibit right now. So this is the home in 1902. This postcard was taken. And of course, Susan was still alive at that time. She died in 1906, 14 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment. But she, of course, was very well known. And so this postcard, the postcards of her home, we have a number of iterations of it, which helped us to determine how to restore the home. The postcards that you're going to see there are about 650 of them altogether. And because they're all over 100 years of age, they're in the public domain, and it wasn't required to do research as far as the producer or the artist of the illustration or the photographer in this case of this particular one. So I'm going to show you about 50 of the postcards in the collection. This next one, of course, is Susan's parents. Her mother, Lucy Reed, gave birth to Susan. Yeah, so Susan's mother, Lucy, gave birth to Susan on February 15th, 1820, 201 years ago today. She was the second of 7 siblings, and her father on the left built, owned, and managed the first whole cloth textile mill in the Berkshires. This image is a picture of the Quaker meeting house where Susan and her family worshiped. It still stands and is in near pristine condition. You'll notice that the men would be on one side and the women would be on the other side in that Quaker meeting house, despite the fact that they were more advanced than most of the other religious sects. Of course, they allowed women to preach, and Susan B. Anthony's paternal sister was a preacher in the meeting house. This photo was made during Anthony's school teaching career, and it's marked as being the earliest photo of Anthony. You wonder what her mother would have thought, because here we do in fact have an image of Susan B. at about age 24. She's no longer wearing her gray wardrobe. She's wearing a gingham dress. This is one of the photographs that was used by Synthespian Studios to regress and create that image that you saw a few minutes ago of Susan. Susan taught for less than 8 years, but it was actually her teaching career that shaped her activism for the next 60 years of her life. Like Anthony, early suffrage leaders were fueled by the temperance movement. So this is where they really got their voice. As teacher, Anthony witnessed firsthand the effects of alcohol on her students. Children were abused by fathers. Children were neglected by mothers who were abused by their husbands. And this particular one says, "My boys may go to ruin through the legalized saloon by your consent, but your boys never will by my consent." And it's really a beautiful representation, many, many heartfelt expressions in the temperance theme of the book. This card poignantly illustrates a school teacher's concern because a family's scant resources, were spent to purchase liquor instead of children's shoes or children's books. And so, like other teachers, Anthony joined a New York State Temperance League. But she was quite naive, and she found out that women were not allowed to speak at these gatherings, which were all run by men. And so suffragists like Anthony found an outlet for their concern for children. And this, of course, is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WCTU wanted more money for education that could come from taxes on the liquor industry for certain, as well as the concern for the health and safety of children. They wanted to prevent children from dying from diseases like swill milk. And this was an epidemic that would poison children. Many children died because it was contamination of cow's milk from whiskey mash. And women knew that if they had the vote, their concerns about what they would be voting for in certain kinds of legislation would be different, perhaps, than men's concerns and needs would be. They really, really needed the vote for this kind of civic engagement. Even beasts of burden were left outside of saloons, and this is a subject. The cruelty to animals is really the only representation I have in a postcard that that directs attention to animals. And the Birthplace Museum has created a kiosk in which we talk about 15 of the social justice issues that are addressed in Susan B. Anthony's newspaper, The Revolution. And vegetarianism and animal cruelty is one of the themes that we explore and index in all of her newspapers. So women saw temperance as a method to really temper or moderate male aggression in what they called the marital bed. So suffrage support for voluntary motherhood and control over family size was directly related, they believed, to liquor consumption. And it was not just liquor. Colorful characters like Carrie Nation condemned cigarette smoking and added that to the ruination of young males. Cards with Carrie were really, really abundant, very, very colorful. Carrie produced and created these cards in order to fund her own activism. But the liquor industry took every opportunity to mock suffrage politics, and they believed that they claimed that if women got the vote, they would devolve into the values and morals of men and smoke and drink too. There we go. So from this grouping, begins a grouping of leather postcards, and some postcard aficionados and people from the United States Postal Service Museum, which is part of the Smithsonian, are just fascinated by these kinds of. I took out some of the more, postal interest from this collection that I'm showing you today, but I did leave this one in. It is a leather postcard. And the sunflower is rampant throughout China in stationery and cards in the suffrage movement. And of course, Kansas, this is the state flower of Kansas, and the sunflower represents suffrage because Kansas was the first state to vote for women's suffrage. The postcards, just by the way, were outlawed in 1909 because of the new postal machines could not cancel them. But these little indentations around the edges were actually used by handcrafters. And they would sew these leather pieces together and create dresser scarves, pillowcases. It's very, very exciting to just see that. So besides voting rights for themselves, suffrage leaders participate in another major movement that was really going to change the world. In that movement, I imagine you all can guess, it was created, this movement, to a large extent by a book that was published in 1852, and it was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It propelled suffragists into connecting domestic and social morality and made the demand for the vote even more convincing. So temperance, abolition, and suffrage proved to be an unstoppable triangulation. It was really a mass movement of radical women bent on creating a better world. Civic dialogue ensued about property rights and whether a human being could be owned by another human being. And outside of the polarizing North and South, it was Kansas again, the home state of Carrie Nation, where the temperance movement really became very, very strong. It was also the first state that granted women's suffrage, and Kansas was the state where John Brown organized his army. Susan's youngest sibling was Merritt, and he became a member of John Brown's army. During the Civil War, women's suffrage activism was really put on hold. But Anthony clung to her Quaker pacifist leanings, and she refused to really give enthusiastic support to the Civil War. Lincoln, however, approved of the three central causes critical to Anthony's activism. And these next postcards demonstrate how every movement, whether suffrage, temperance, or abolition, appropriated Lincoln for their cause. About suffrage, he says, I think I can read that. I believe in sharing in the privileges of government, by no means excluding women. This is a very lukewarm endorsement of suffrage, but Anthony and her abolition colleagues clung to it anyway. But Anthony thought the new president was too weak in his opposition to slavery. She stated that her cause was human rights, not just women's rights. When her father died in 1862, Anthony chose Frederick Douglass to give the eulogy. And this kind of friendship was unheard of, not only prior to emancipation, but throughout the entire 19th century. Despite this personal friendship, modern day scholars do accuse suffragists, including Anthony, of racist leanings. These accusations are not without merit. This is one of several popular handmade cards in the collection. The 15th Amendment that gave Negro men the vote left out women, both Black and white. Suffrage leaders were just bitter and angry and hostile about this. And so images like this blackface handcrafted card displayed their hostility. This is another image in the collection. This is actually not a postcard, but it's the cover of a small pamphlet that has been on display in the Susan B. Anthony birthplace. It portrays women's bitterness and anger. And it was a bitterness that split the women's movement in 1870 when the 15th Amendment gave Black men the vote. And yes, you heard that right. It was 1870. So it was actually 150 years ago after the suffrage, when the suffrage amendment was passed in 1920. So this was 1850. Last year was a huge year. So it was the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment. It was the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and it was Susan B. Anthony's 200th anniversary. All a big, big time. But this rift in the women's movement lasted for a full 20 years. This next card I'm putting with the abolition cards, it's the study of phrenology. And it was sort of a parlor game, but taken much more seriously than we would consider something like signature analysis. Susan B. Anthony actually had her head read in 1852. And what you do is you measure the bumps and crevices of the head, and you can tell a person's character and skills. And it was sort of a way to understand the differences, not only between men and women, but it was the differences between what they considered lower class people. This was during the Darwinian era when phrenology was popular. Interestingly enough, when Susan B. Anthony had her head read, of course, she was not popular. This was in 1852. But the reading of her head is displayed in the museum, and it indicates some of the astounding characteristics of her as a leader in her potential to be head of that suffrage movement. This woman, however, that you see here, she has a Votes for Women flyer on her lap. This woman is having her head read against the backdrop of a well-known criminal who's on the left and a British diplomat on the right. And it really is a eugenic commentary. It's a method of discrimination on the basis of class and gender, and was particularly, as I said, popular during the Darwinian era. After the Civil War, Anthony published The Revolution. and it was by far the most outspoken woman-run newspaper of its kind. Its editor was none other than Anthony's colleague and closest ally, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The motto of the paper was, "Men their rights and nothing more, women their rights and nothing less." The Birthplace Museum has nearly a full collection of these newspapers. We have one of the largest collections in the country. The inaugural edition of the paper, which you see here, stated two policies. The first one is portrayed in this postcard. There were to be no standing armies. Suffragists, of course, supported less aggressive means to settle conflict. They wanted to bring men out of the bars and off the battlefield and into the home where families, could be nurtured. But every postcard that proclaimed a good reason for women to vote, there was going to be a postcard with its converse. And this postcard is an anti-suffrage mockery. If women got the vote, they would only take up male-dominated values and fight wars too. The second policy of the revolution was that there would be no advertisements for quack or immoral medicines, or restalism, which is the derogatory term for abortion. Over 20 editorials in Anthony's newspaper, many were written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton herself, condemned abortion using straightforward language. They called it feticide and infanticide. They were equally interchangeable. They called abortion child murder or crime against humanity. As a matter of fact, next to women getting the vote and dress reform, restalism and abortion was the most discussed issue in the revolution. This has probably got a lot to do with the fact that Madame Restel, who was an infamous abortionist in New York City, was at this time in and out of jail, in and out of court. And so many of the newspapers in the country were talking about abortion, were talking about Restel. And so restalism became this derogatory word that was discussed over 120 times, as a matter of fact, in the copies of the Revolution. Suffrage leaders believed that if women had the right to education, to employment, injustices like poverty, abortion, and prostitution that destroy children would be greatly reduced. This particular postcard is published by the Chicago Probation League when Jane Addams was at Hull House. The illustrator of this piece is Nina Allinger, the designated cartoonist for The Suffragist, the magazine of the National Women's Party itself. Child saving is women's work, and this is a theme that is throughout the collection. It connects the domestic sphere and the civic sphere, and it proclaims that the woman's vote would strengthen motherhood and families. Allender, by the way, popularized the iconic donkey for Democrats and elephant for Republicans moniker. So this push-pull of children and families is the theme, as I said, of nearly a third of the postcards. Anti-suffragists argued that children would suffer if women got the vote. The home would be abandoned. But suffragists countered that the domestic sphere would not be destroyed, that it would actually be enhanced. They could do both. These are some of the more thoughtful expressions among the collection. These are published by the National Women's Suffrage Association and was the association of which Susan B. Anthony was president. They sold these postcards. I have 18 of these in my collection. No, I have 15 in my collection. There are 18 all told that were printed, but they're very beautifully crafted with a purple ribbon, tastefully done. They make clear that the central part of this domestic life and civil life was certainly the mother. Many of these make that very, very clear. Postcards often employed non-threatening images, and so they used children and animals to promote their message. Cards like these were sold at fairs and church festivals, at municipal picnics, and actually at booths on street corners in New York City. These two sweet images display the innocence of children. Don't you love these? They make a statement about the virtuousness of their cause. They demonstrate how children were symbolic of their motherly nurturing. Even holidays were opportunities to sell and raise money by selling postcards. And many of the cards are Valentines. Aren't these dear? These Valentines are just so dear. And the Easter, they really were suffrage favorites, Valentines. And oftentimes these cards were just sent to wish someone a happy birthday. The messages on the back are quite entertaining, but I don't want to get off track on that. Leap year cards. Actually, 2020 was a leap year. And these two cards are 1908 and 1912, smack right in the middle of the high stakes campaign for the right to vote. So these were very, very popular during that time. Children and animals were used in propaganda by those opposed to women's suffrage. So like, social media today, no other medium really lent itself to exaggeration and ridicule, like the hasty tweet of a 1-cent postcard stamp. And then the women would come back and put men in their place. Don't you love it? Don't you love it? But nothing was sacrosanct. Postcard caricatures of Anthony herself portraying women as menacing and intimidating were forever very popular. The anti-suffrage cards claimed that women who engaged in politics were going to disrupt the family. Not only, were children going to suffer, but fathers who were left to care for them were going to suffer even more. But it even got worse. Do you just not love these? These are male and female role reversals which are very popular in the cards. The domestic sphere and the civic sphere were going to be topsy-turvy. My collection has 7 of this series. They're by Dunstan Weiler lithographs, and these are hands down the favorite of everybody who sees the cards. But more in the artist series, which is a whole section in the book. These are by Walter Wellman and are known by the soft greens and pinks. There are 16 in a full set, and I have 13 of these. But Wellman predicts that there would be frilly senatoresses and overbearing judgettes if we had the vote. In Horror of Horrors, women would take up pastimes like golf. And I remember when I purchased this card, the woman sold it to me for only $3 because it had the writing all over it, but she didn't know that the writing actually made it more valuable. I love it. Susan B. Anthony pledged her own life insurance to advance education for women. And other women, however, feared disruption in the domestic sphere. And this is interesting. It was actually women who made up the largest segment of anti-suffragists. They asserted that cheerleading was not useful knowledge. And women who wanted economic rights, the anti-suffragists declared actually already had them. But a significant revolution was going on that was even greater than Anthony's newspaper. It was the bicycle. Anthony claimed that the bicycle represented women's freedom more than any other domestic item. Not only was the two-wheeled contraption would propel women to independence, it was a measure of her independence. And since, of course, she couldn't ride a bicycle wearing a corset and 11 pounds of petticoats, freedom of movement required different clothing for her. So women no longer had to dress to please men. And I just love this card. What does it say? She says, is this the way to wear them? And he says, I don't know, old gal. Oh, my old gal always wears them underneath. Just so fun. So next to getting the vote in condemning restalism or condemning abortion, dress reform is the most discussed item in the revolution. And to go different places, she no longer needed a chaperone to go where she pleased. You see, she could paddle her own canoe. This is one of the leather postcards. The jocular exchange, you know, continued on and extended to other modes of transportation. And again, here she is riding a donkey. And it was the Democrats who were very slow to come around to suffrage. They were slower than the Republicans. Republicans, of course, were more in favor of abolition than the Democrats in the mid 18th century. And of course, in the first half of the 19th century, Democrats were not as warm to the idea of suffrage as Republicans were. Even Woodrow Wilson, who finally approved the 19th Amendment, did so without great enthusiasm. So there was a lot of discussion about the pants in the family, you know, who was going to buy them and who was going to wear them and who was going to own them. But postcard propaganda was not all innocence. These representations are in a section called violence. Many of these hostile images in my collection were printed in Germany for the American market right before World War I. They were likely produced, and this is my own observation. I'm concluding that they are likely to have been produced and distributed by the American Brewers Association. It was one of the stronger beer producers who wanted to silence women who favored prohibition. And so it's no surprise that the 19th Amendment was passed only after the Prohibition Amendment was passed. The liquor industry had no cause to continue the fight against women's suffrage. They ridiculed women who wanted the vote and who claimed to be more nurturing. This particular card is a hard-hitting card and is part of the foreign section in the book. The foreign cards are from countries such as Mexico, Ireland, certainly Germany, Croatia even, Italy even. This particular card is a French suffrage card. And I needed a great deal of help in interpreting this one, and I got it from Dr. Jennifer Popiel, who is the French women's historian from University of Missouri. And in both of the cards, this one and the next one that you'll see, the woman is wearing the costume of a French lawyer in turn of the century Paris, when women were first entering the legal profession. This caricature portrays a mother ignoring the needs of her child while pursuing a public career in law. The translation reads, and some of you may be able to read that, but it says, "I turn out of respect for the court. My child is forgotten while I am making my argument. This second card is another in that same series where the child is a symbol of derision by those advancing their own rights. It employs a great deal of sarcasm. Women were known to condemn men for embracing gambling and rejecting religious mores and abandoning the home, while women who behave like men and lack responsibility for a child's care are awarded a career. In the postcards from other countries, many of these are from Great Britain, and suffragists were, of course, into the iconic window smashing. It was used both to promote and oppose the suffrage in the American movement. Alice Paul would have none of this violence in the American movement, but a number of these, of course, I'm sure you have seen the iconic postcard on the right, which goes into the photographic postcards of the window smashing, women being arrested, of course, in Great Britain for their violence, but in the United States, they were arrested for peacefully demonstrating like Alice Paul was. As the news of violence spread through postcard exchanges, so did the communication of those who used it to harm, which I consider harm, or to further their cause. It contrasted with Americans' nonviolent strategies. And so the photographic section of the postcards really became an asset to the cause in the years immediately prior to suffrage. No longer were descriptions of rallies and parades left up to the biases of newspapers. You could see how many people were at a parade. But again, humor proliferated, and here men are in drag, purporting to be a women's baseball team. They claim that men, on the back it says, men use their lefts to fight women's rights. And this is the last card. Anthony could, really never have imagined that her photo would travel all over the world. Surely failure is indeed impossible. So thank you so much.